In this freewheeling interview, Lori Williams, one of the world's premier trainers of remote viewing, discusses many topics you won't find anywhere else. Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today is a very special day. Once again, in my Albuquerque studio, I'm with a live guest, Lori Williams. Lori is the founder of Intuitive Specialists, which is probably the world's premier organization these days training remote viewers. She is the author of Monitoring, a book about how to be a monitor in remote viewing experiments and exercises. She is also the author of a book titled Boundless, Your How-To Guide to Practical Remote Viewing. We're going to have an open-ended conversation, but I imagine it will gravitate towards the question of using remote viewing to explore some of the mysteries associated with UFOs and alien contacts, and I'm sure we'll touch on many other topics. Welcome, Lori.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeffrey. I'm honored to be among the many illustrious guests you've had on your show. I'm a big fan. I love watching your show. And many of my audience and my students love watching your show as well.
I'm honored that they do and that you do. And of course, you're one of my favorite guests. And so I hope that you'll come back many, many times. I find that a conversation with you is always fascinating.
Thanks so much. It amazes me how you and Janelle have become such good friends of ours over these years now, that since we first started doing this together. Mm-hmm. And we have Jim here in the studio as well. Always here inspiring in his quiet way.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's worth mentioning for the benefit of our viewers that you returned from a month in Ecuador just about a week ago.
That's right. I just spent a month in Ecuador. Ecuador has been a long-time love of mine. I lived there between 1982 and 1988. And I thought when I would go back that everything would have changed so dramatically that it would have kind of lost its luster for me. But it hasn't changed that much. It's the people of Ecuador that I'm in love with. Mm-hmm. They're warm and generous. And, you can spend a month in Ecuador and make more friends than you could make in 10 years, in the United States. It feels like the people are amazing. And of course, the country itself is beautiful. I spent the entire month in the mountains among the volcanoes there. They have, I think, 23 volcanoes in Ecuador. And, so I spent time near the Cotopaxi volcano and the Imbabura volcano, and just gorgeous views everywhere. Mm-hmm. I also had some interesting experience with shamans in Ecuador.
Mm-hmm. To be fair, I'm under the impression you felt the need to leave the United States.
I did. I felt the need to leave the United States. I was normally, in my life, to try to keep my energy high, my vibration high, I always feel like, in a way, I don't belong to myself. I belong to the people I serve, that I'm here on this planet to serve my students, to serve those who are interested in raising consciousness and wanting to explore their own potential psychically and intuitively in whatever ways. And so I've always felt this drive to be a teacher and to share. But to do that, you have to maintain your spiritual energy. Mm-hmm. So that means taking care of yourself spiritually and eating the right food, getting enough sleep, and reading and taking in the right materials to keep your energy high. So suddenly I found myself reading the news all the time, watching the news, and which is something I never was doing before. So I'm watching the news and looking at what's happening and and also I'm very much an empath. So I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling anxious and having a lot of just anxiety about what was going on and picking up on other people's anxiety. And I even started posting in Facebook and things and in ways that were not the way I normally do. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, okay, wait a minute. I'm kind of veering off from my place here. I'm kind of moving out of my lane. And a long time ago, I had a vision, so to speak, when I was meditating. And I saw a horse with blinders on. And because, there's so many causes that a compassionate person is drawn to. Let's, save the whales or, save all the puppies in the shelters or whatever. Let's take care of people who are downtrodden, etc. And in this vision, I saw the horse with the blinders on, and I was told, you have a specific purpose. And for now, you have to keep those blinders on so that you don't get drawn away and everything becomes diluted as you're pulled in all these different directions, but instead stay on your path and stay focused on what you're here to do. Because it's like there's no one else doing exactly what you're doing, so you need to do that. And so here I found myself getting pulled in all these different directions and getting very off center. Mm-hmm. And I did feel like I got knocked off my center in a way. And so I thought, okay, the solution for this is I need to get out of the country for a little while. And I thought, where have I been longing to go for 37 years ever since I left Ecuador? And Jim's like, sweetie, you need to scratch that itch. He said, you've been talking about Ecuador ever since I met you. Mm-hmm. And we've been together now almost 25 years. Mm-hmm. So we thought, okay, I said, okay, well, I'm going to go for a month. I don't want to just go there for a few days. I want to go and stay for a month. And he said, okay, that sounds great. He was thinking of all the great things he would do while I was gone and all the maintenance he would do out on the 120 acres. And then I said, well, actually, though, I've always really wanted to show you Ecuador. How about if you come with me for the first week? Because then I can speak Spanish and get us through the customs and all that. And so we did. We decided he would come for the week. And as we were going through customs, it was pretty funny because we were going through immigration and I'm speaking fluent Spanish to these young ladies who were stamping us through. And I said, actually, I lived in Ecuador for 6 years and I had 3 children here. And they said, oh, my 3 children. And then they looked at Jim like he's the father of these 3 children. And I said, oh, no, that was a different husband. Otro esposo. Eso fue otro esposo. And Jim understands enough Spanish that he understood otro esposo. So as we're walking away, he said, did you say you came here to look for another husband? I'm like, no. I said I was here with another husband, but so we had a good laugh. But so we hired a guide who was an amazing guy named Christian who took us to a lot of places to show us things. And he didn't just take us to the normal places. He did. He took us to, we saw a couple of churches and, some monuments and things. But then he drove us off the beaten path and he took us up to 15,000 feet up high in the mountains. And we visited a woman named Maria, who was an indigenous woman. She lives in a mud hut with her husband with a grass roof. And they raise alpacas and guinea pigs. And guinea pig is a delicacy in Ecuador. A lot of people eat guinea pigs. And I got to say, for those on your audience, I did not eat guinea pig. I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
They're so cute.
They're so cute. I couldn't bear to do it. Yeah. But, and also when they're skinned and they're in they're ready to put it on a spit or whatever, they look like big rats, So I was like, I don't think I want to eat guinea pig. But, Maria was so gracious, and she was showing us how she takes the wool of the alpaca and spins it into yarn and makes all kinds of products with it. And I bought 15 little mini alpacas that she had created from alpaca wool and put on keychains. And I bought them for $2 a piece to give to my grandkids. And it was just a delightful visit. We took pictures with her beautiful alpacas and with Maria. And then we were so delighted to have this experience up in the mountains and to see their culture and also to help them financially because they don't have a lot of money. But yet they're so happy. They own their own place.
I believe Ecuador is among the world's poorest countries.
It may be, but they seem to have a thriving economy. When we were there, they back in 2001, they switched to the U.S. dollar from the sucre. And we didn't see, even though some people were what we would consider in poverty, people all seemed to be working. You never saw homeless folks anywhere. People all seemed to be working and busy and happy. So many people just seemed so happy.
I'm under the impression that oftentimes in cultures like that, people take care of each other. I had visitors from Africa who say you can go into a very poor African village and no one is starving.
Yes. I didn't see anyone starving there either. No one was starving. And in Ecuador also seems to be very industrious, and they produce their own medicine, their own things, just
very self-sufficient.
Very self-sufficient. They make almost everything. You didn't see a lot of imports there. So I was impressed with that.
Well, while you were out of the country, things have been bubbling up around here, particularly in the area of what people now call UFO disclosure. We have whistleblowers coming out of the woodwork and all sorts of claims that government or perhaps private companies subcontracting with the government are engaged in an active program of UFO retrievals, captures, including capturing what are known as biologics associated with the UFOs, sometimes referred to as biological robots. The little grays, I presume. The details are kind of sketchy, but it seems as if large numbers of remote viewers have been employed in this effort to communicate with UFOs, to help lure them to a place where they can be captured.
I was not aware of any luring of UFOs. It does remind me, though, of talking with Dr. Stephen Greer, and when he does his events, he has everyone meditate and request UFOs to appear, and they do. I mean, when you go to his events, you'll see things in the sky that show up as everyone's focusing. So when you were telling me about people using, like emitting love and luring these UFOs in, it reminded me of that because that's pretty much what he does. He doesn't lure them in, but he requests them to show up, and they do. This though then leads me to think about the whole question of simulation and manifesting reality. Yes. Because, there's the old story about the Nina the Pinta and the Santa Maria showing up on the shores, and the natives not seeing the boats because they couldn't conceive of boats. They had never seen boats before. And it was supposedly the shamans who said, there are these things approaching. There are incidences where large numbers of people would be exposed to a UFO showing up in the sky, where some of the people see it and some of the people don't. And it's right there. And I remember once years ago, for those of your listeners who may not know who Mel Riley was, Melvin Riley was the first remote viewer inducted into the newly formed Stargate unit. When it was first formed, he was the first guy that Skip Atwater chose to be in the unit. At Fort Meade. At Fort Meade, Maryland, to be in the applications unit. And he was the only one who was in for 2 tours of duty. But he and I were really dear friends. And one night he called me, and I was walking around outside, and he said, wow. And he was living in Wisconsin, in a place called Scandinavia, Wisconsin. When people would say, where is Mel Riley? He's in Scandinavia. But he lived in Scandinavia, Wisconsin, which was very remote. And his sister lived 6 miles from him. And she had called him and said, Mel, there's this massive ship up in the sky right now. And there are all these little ships going back and forth to it. So he runs outside and he sees it too. It's a massive thing. And so then he calls me and he's like, Lori, there's this massive ship up in the sky over Wisconsin. Now, of course, at the time, I think I was in New Mexico, but I was like, okay, I don't see anything over here, but it's interesting because I was thinking, okay, even if Scandinavia is remote, if there's something so huge in the sky and Mel and his sister see it, why did we not hear about it? Why wasn't it reported in the newspapers, especially one that's so big that you could see little ships going to and fro? And I think it's because there must be some sort of a phenomena happening, whether it's a simulation, whether it's something that works through consciousness that either allows some people to see things and others don't, whether it works through our belief system. Like people who don't believe in ghosts, you rarely see ghosts, and then there are those who see ghosts all the time. So when you think about, I was joking with you earlier, we should name this talk Aliens, Ghosts, and Entities, how do they all relate? But nowadays we have so many things we're dealing with at once. We have climate change, we have politics, we have economics, we have supernatural phenomenon, we have the exploration into plant medicine and its use for healing and people working through trauma. And now we have this whole UFO phenomena and disclosure. And it's almost like, where do we put our attention now with so many things happening all around us? And how are these things all connected?
Yeah. Change is in the air.
Change is in the air. I think this is a phenomenal time to be alive. We are living at a really pivotal point in world history, I believe. And I think that it's really exciting. It's an exciting time to be alive. And I think going to Ecuador helped me a lot because as I was thinking about my love for Ecuador is not a perfect country. Jim and I were stuck for 2 hours in the middle of the night due to a landslide. We were on the highway. We weren't covered by dirt, but we were stuck in a long line of traffic that was blocked because the road was blocked, and they had to get crews out there and clear.
Well, that could happen anywhere.
That could happen anywhere. It does happen a lot in Ecuador. Yeah. Because it's, especially in the mountains, it's so hilly and they have to cut through the mountains to make these the highways.
And the roads are narrow, I imagine.
Well, actually, that was one thing, a big change I saw was that the roads have been vastly improved since when I lived there. And so they're actually great roads, but they often don't have, I don't know if they don't use the technology or whatever to keep the things really stable when they're vertical like this and you're going through a mountain pass. Now you see sometimes when you're driving around here in New Mexico, you see where they've kind of cemented the sides so that they don't come down. But they do get a lot of rain up there in the mountains, and then the rain softens the earth and then slides into the road. We saw a lot of landslides while we were there. But we also had this wonderful experience of going to a sanctuary where we would just sit with our hands out, and they would give us little caps like Coca-Cola bottle caps with a little bit of sugar water in it, and all these beautiful hummingbirds would come and land on our hands and drink out of the caps. And we went to a butterfly sanctuary where we saw the morpho butterflies, the big blue ones, and they were landing on Jim. They didn't land on me, but they landed on Jim. And Jim has such a quiet, sweet spirit. I think the butterflies were just attracted to him. And we had all these wonderful, wonderful experiences while we were there. We also stayed in a hotel that they called a hacienda that welcomed its first guest in 1695.
Nice.
And our room seemed really spooky. And it was all, big stones and a big stone fireplace. And I thought, 500 years, we're bound to see a ghost. We did not see a ghost the whole time we were there. And
we've already done a previous interview with you about your mediumship, so you're prone to see ghosts if they're around.
So I thought, we're bound to see a ghost. 500 years, there's bound to be something here. We didn't see a ghost while we were there. Maybe we were too excited and tired to deal with ghosts that night, but it was a great visit. But one of the things that it helped me with, as far as my relationship with Ecuador and my relationship with the U.S. and everything that's going on, was I thought, okay, I love Ecuador unconditionally in spite of its faults and failings as a country. And I love the people there. And even though, of course, people are people everywhere, right? And there's imperfect people, and there's murderers in Ecuador too. It's not like Ecuador doesn't have any crime. And so I thought, okay, how come I can have this grace and this unconditional love going to Ecuador? Can't I have the same thing for the U.S.? So coming back, I really looked for the good in everyone I met, and everywhere I looked, I tried to just look for good. And I did see a lot of good. There's wonderful people here. And there's wonderful things happening here, in spite of things that we might find very frightening or disturbing, both of which are happening. But, so it's not necessarily that if you look for the good, you're lacking compassion for those who might be suffering or for other things. It's just that we have to have a balance, because I realized if I just allow myself to go down a dark hole of negative thinking, that I wouldn't be able to serve the people that I'm here to serve. So that was my reason for going to Ecuador, and it really served that purpose, and coming back and feeling rested and with greater clarity and greater compassion and love than ever, to be able to come back and be here for that.
The point that I'm gathering from what you've just said is that to be effective in the field of remote viewing, you have to be attuned spiritually.
That is so true. And even Mel Riley, who spent 8 years, going through this whole thing in the military unit, he said people would often come into the unit atheist. He said no one left atheist, which I thought was interesting. He also said there were people who would come in whose main goal was to make money from this. Ooh, to make money from this. And he said, those people never did anything with it, never went anywhere, never became good remote viewers. He said the people who became world class in the remote viewing were people who truly were approaching it from a spiritual standpoint, either wanted to use it for good, wanted to explore themselves, because remote viewing can be an amazing self-discovery tool. And so those are the people who become the world-class remote viewers, I think. And I think that at the core of it is curiosity, too. Spirituality, love, and curiosity are the keys.
Well, I'm going to drift us back to the UFO topic, if I may, because I know from the very beginning, the remote viewers at Fort Meade and elsewhere were curious about UFOs. It's a big mystery. It's been going on at least since the 1940s here in the United States. Nobody seems to be able to come up with a definitive explanation of what's going on. Many people try to deny that anything significant is happening, but if you look at the evidence, it's quite obvious. Decade after decade after decade, reputable witnesses, cogent, intelligent, clear-headed people report having had sightings, sometimes contacts, sometimes abductions. And as a matter of fact, you yourself have a suspicion that you as a child had such experiences.
Yes, I do think that I'm probably an abductee. I had that near-death experience as a baby, and then I have clear memories from the time I was very small of having dreams, and those dreams are still very vivid to me. I've never forgotten them, of beings coming. There was always 3 beings. They were always male. They felt male, and they were not your traditional angels, all dressed in white with big wings or anything. These were, they had dark hair, long dark hair. They had dark clothing, and they didn't have wings. And they would come in and they would take me out of my body and take me to classrooms.
They were humanoids.
They were humanoid, very humanoid looking. And we always spoke telepathically. We know, and that as a baby, I was 3 years old or 4 years old. I'd be like, wow, we don't have to use our mouths. We can talk with our minds. I was amazed by that. And I would ask them questions, and they would say, I would say, are you God? No, I'm not God. Are you the devil? No, we're not devils. And I would ask if they were angels, and they would never respond to that question. So they didn't claim to be angels either. So now that I've heard testimonials from other people who've had similar experiences, I'm thinking these must be abduction experiences.
Well, they took you to a classroom. When you say abduction, though, did you go along willingly, or was it?
Yeah, I mean,
So it wasn't against your will?
No, it wasn't against my will. It was, I would feel myself being lifted out of my body, and we would be conversing, and we'd be flying, essentially, and we'd be flying through space, and then I'd find myself in these classrooms, and I knew I was being taught. I don't remember what I was being taught, unfortunately, but I do remember being in classrooms. And since then, I've talked to many people, who have similar remembrances of dreams in which they were taken out of their bodies and taken to classrooms.
As a matter of fact, there is a book written by a psychiatrist, Shafia Karagula, called Breakthrough to Creativity, which one of her psychiatric patients, as an adult, is describing this experience and in therapy. And so Karagula asks the patient, I think she called her a woman named Diane, she said, do you recognize anyone else in the classroom? And she said, well, now that you ask me, yes, there's a man in the classroom who I know. He lives in New York, some distance away. And they reached out to that person and learned that he's having the same dreams.
That is fascinating because throughout my life, there are many incidences in which my former husband, Albert, and I found ourselves having the same dream and interacting with each other in the same dream at night. One of my children, Elizabeth, and I used to have same dreams. In fact, one night, her dad and I and she were all interacting in the same dreams. And there were 2 dreams in which we interacted with each other. And we all got together in the morning. We're like, oh my gosh, I dreamt about, we were all we all had the same dream and we were interacting in the dream. So what does that tell you about consciousness and our connections to each other? For one. Yeah. And then also if you connect it back to the UFO question, and abduction experiences, if you call it, like you said, abduction sounds like it's against your will. Yeah. What would you call it then? It's just that that's what everybody refers to these days.
Well, we could call it a visitation, perhaps.
Yes.
It's very interesting that you brought up this experience and now the concept of mutual dreaming. Mm-hmm. It's only been a few weeks now since I did a live stream event with my partner here at New Thinking Aloud, my co-host, Emmy Vadnais, about what can you do if, in a case, let's say a married couple, you're getting older, one of you is probably going to die before the other, and if you want to maintain contact with that person, whoever goes first, to stay in touch with each other, how can you prepare for that? And so I suggested, because I'd done an interview years and years ago with a lady named Linda Lane Magalon, who wrote a book. Magillon, actually, is the pronunciation. She wrote the book, Mutual Dreaming, and she leads dream workshops where people practice that art of mutual dreaming. And I said, if you begin to practice having mutual dreams with the person you're interested in maintaining contact with, that will help.
That is fascinating. That's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that they got in touch with the guy in New York. He was having the same experiences. Yes. And I think I've told you that Jim and I, before we met, were dreaming about each other.
Oh, before you ever met.
Before we ever met, we began having dreams about each other. Mm-hmm. And so we were connecting, before we met. And then there was something you said about the man in New York having the same experience. Yeah. I know what it was I was going to tell you. So many years ago, I went to high school with this girl. Her name's Sarah. She and I were really good friends. We both joined this group together that it was a cult, essentially. Mm-hmm. We both joined the cult together at the same time when we graduated. We went off to the cult. She ended up going off into one direction. I went off in another. We both met people and got married and started having kids. Throughout the next 20, 30 years, I would have dreams of Sarah. Mm-hmm. And in my dreams, she would tell me what was happening in her life. Mm-hmm. We would meet in this kind of void, this white void, and she would tell me everything that's been going on in her life. And so she told me about meeting her husband. She told me about having the different babies. Mm-hmm. Then she told me she was thinking of leaving her husband. Mm-hmm. Then she told me she was, what was going on. And then her husband met me in the void and told me she's leaving me and she's leaving the kids with me. And I don't know what to do. And then I met her on the street in my dream and she wouldn't talk to me. Mm-hmm. So later, many years later, a dear friend of mine that was a mutual friend in high school had been a counselor to her. And he was able to verify all the dreams and the times that I'd had them. And those things were actually happening at those times in her life. So she was communicating with me throughout her life, and it was all accurate information. I've since had that happen with other people as well, where we meet in the void and they tell me what's happening, find out that was accurate. And so I really believe these things are real. They're really happening. They're not just figments of our imagination. And it demonstrates how fluid we are, or as Janelle likes to say, how porous things are. We're very fluid, and we definitely can connect with each other in realms and in levels of the ethers, I guess you could say, that are non-physical. And we are non-physical beings living in physical bodies, right? So, wow, it's all a huge mystery, but I find it still so fascinating. I've been into this now for most of my life, and I still find it amazingly fascinating. The great mystery.
Well, in your case, these events started early on in your childhood.
Yes. My earliest memories, from, I guess from the near-death experience to from then on, I just had all these different experiences. And I think that there's something, because they've done many studies now on children who had near-death experiences, and they do tend to have a high degree of psychic ability, and they do tend to see things other people don't see, or ghosts or whatever. So I think that, and we were talking earlier about how when I first met Jim and I could hear his thoughts in my head, in his voice, and then I would ask him, did you just think these words? And he would go, yes. I think he was very brave to marry me after that, because a lot of guys would not have had the chutzpah.
Well, but if you'd been dreaming about you before he even met you, that's pretty compelling.
It is. It is pretty compelling. And we had a pretty interesting first encounter when we did actually meet. He said as soon as he saw me coming across the lawn, a voice in his head said, there she is. And then later that night, after a 5-hour really engrossing conversation, when he was going to bed that night, the little voice said, you can stop searching now. And for me, on my end, it was more like I had been sick for 40 days. I had been hemorrhaging. And I'd been to all these doctors, and I was in horrible pain, and they tried this drug and that hormone and all these things. Nothing fixed it. And I was going through a really tough time in my life. And I think that was kind of a manifestation of the emotional angst I was experiencing. But after that 5-hour conversation, the bleeding stopped, and I felt spontaneously healed. And so I didn't have the same reaction to him that he had to me initially, but I did know this is a friend for life, and his name is Jim, and the woman that we were interacting with, a mutual friend, her name was Sue. And when I was a little girl and I had nothing to do and I'd be in the back seat on a long trip or something, I would play with my fingers, and this was Jim and this was Sue, and they were like my little friends. And I would play with them forever. So all of a sudden I meet Jim and Sue, and I thought, oh, this is going to change my life. I knew that it was a turning point in my life, and it really, truly was.
Well, I know that although you had what was probably not an actual abduction experience, and it's not clear that these figures who took you to the classroom, who or what they were, we can't say for sure they're aliens, but you have had clients come to you who have had similar experiences. And I think if I recall correctly, they came to you for hypnosis.
That is true. So when we were in Amarillo, we had a 14-year hypnosis practice, and we had an office for hypnosis. And there was a period in which I had 3 different gentlemen come to me separately, and they were your typical Texan guys with the big hats and the big belts and they say never marry a man whose belt buckle's bigger than his head, but and the cowboy boots and everything, the jeans. They were your typical Texan men, married to women with the big hair and the big blonde hair. But so I considered them kind of stereotypical Texan guys. They were also really successful business owners. 2 of them were involved in construction and oil wells, and then there was another guy who had another business in town. And they were all friends with each other. And I don't think they knew that they were all coming to me for hypnosis. But somehow, somewhere along the line, they discovered when in talking to each other, they were all coming to me. And then they all told me that they were really coming to me because they wanted to talk about aliens and UFOs. And they had all been approached they had all seen UFOs. And these were church-going, devout Christian guys who were suddenly having interactions with spaceships that were flying overhead. And then they were contacted by a man who called himself General Jeremiah. This man was an American man. I think he's passed away now, but he was an American guy who claimed to be the ambassador for Earth, I believe, or was it just the United States? I don't remember, but he was an ambassador to the Galactic Federation. Now, at the time that I heard this, my first reaction was skepticism. I think it's healthy to have a degree of skepticism whenever you hear something initially. Yeah. And check it out. So my first reaction was like, wait a minute now, is that real? Yeah. And so the first thing I did was call Mel Riley. And I said, Mel, have you ever heard of the Galactic Federation? And Mel's like, yes, I've been there. I was like, what? You've been there? Turns out that in the unit, he was tasked with, blind tasked. So that means he didn't know what he was remote viewing. He was blind tasked with viewing the Galactic Federation. And he said it was the first time he had a complete bilocation experience where he was 100% there. He said, I was totally there. And I completely lost all consciousness of my real surroundings. And I was 100% there at the Galactic Federation. And he described it as being similar to being in a temple in Egypt. And there was a dais and all these things. And I think you can read about that experience in a book by Jim Marrs that was called Alien Agenda. And in the Alien Agenda, Jim Marrs wrote a lot of marvelous books, and he was an amazing journalist. And that book, Alien Agenda, talks about Mel's experience at the Galactic Federation. But back to General Jeremiah. So General Jeremiah would contact these men frequently and give them guidance and ask them to do things. And then they were contacted by these aliens who asked them to buy land very close to Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. So they bought this big piece of land, and then they were told that there were artifacts buried there, and so they were going to the land, and they were taking heavy equipment, and they were digging and doing all this. And one of the men, the main guy who now owns that piece of property, he bought everybody else out, and he owns it. His name is Dwayne Ollinger. And Dwayne Ollinger, and the reason I can speak Dwayne's name on camera for your show is because Dwayne Ollinger is the main character now in the second most popular show of the Discovery Channel, which is called Blind Frog Ranch. And it is about this piece of property and about everything that took place there.
Oh, my.
And Dwayne asked Jim and I to go out there, along with a good friend of ours who's a Navajo Indian. His name is Mark Julian. And we all went out there together to this piece of land to try to determine, through remote viewing and through all the techniques we could put together, what is the artifact? What was the thing? Now, they've never found an actual artifact that would be astounding. But what we did determine was that the water that they were pulling up from the earth there was something very special about it. And since then, they've done many experiments with this water and have found a lot of things. And then Dwayne was also able to take dirt and put it into a machine he invented that would take the dirt and compress it really, really hard, and out would come these metal pieces. It would kind of extract everything, and he would have these metal pendants that he would extract from just plain dirt. And he brought me one of the pendants, and so now Dwayne is a movie star. He's a television celebrity, which is interesting because we never dreamed. This was many, many years ago. We never dreamed that it would come around to all this.
When he first came to you for hypnosis, you had no idea what it would lead to.
No, we had no idea what it would lead to. The interesting thing is that, throughout those months and years that we worked with these three gentlemen, they were having some pretty outstanding UFO experiences. And so I also had the honor, Jim and I were flown to Wisconsin. We keep having Wisconsin come up in our conversation.
And I'm from Wisconsin.
You're from Wisconsin. My sister lives in Wisconsin. Yeah. So we were flown to Wisconsin. Was it Black Falls, Wisconsin. And we were asked by the head of MUFON for Wisconsin if we would do a special session on an incident that was called the Kinross incident, which took place in the 1950s. It was a UFO incident in which the Air Force, based in Madison, found a blip on their radar, and they scrambled some jets to go intercept the blip, and they watched on the radar as the two things came together and then vanished. And it was over the Great Lakes, and this was in the 50s, the 1950s, and I was born in 57, so it was somewhere in that vicinity. And so, first of all, I was tasked initially, before we were flown to Wisconsin, I was initially contacted to just do a remote viewing session, to be a remote viewer and to do a remote viewing session, blind task on an event. I was told the target's an event, describe the target. And I worked on this very thoroughly and created a huge document, not huge, but a thorough document about the incident. I actually drew the jets that were scrambled. They had unusual, like, black markings on these silver jets, and I drew the markings on the jets. And meanwhile, Mel Riley was also a paid viewer on the same project, and we experienced the same things. And then they flew us to Wisconsin, and so it was Jim and myself and Mel Riley and another viewer that was working on the project. So the four of us show up in Wisconsin. And we worked on maps. We had all been given these gigantic blank maps to dowse for the location where they might find the wreckage at the bottom of the ocean. And the plan was to fly us over and help us to actually show where we thought it was. And then they were going to send submersibles, robotic submersibles down to try to find this wreckage.
You mean Lake Michigan, probably.
In Lake Michigan, yes. And it was actually close to the Canadian side. But so when we did all this work, when they were going to bring in planes and submersibles, that's when it kind of ended, because the time of year, I think it was November, and the pilots were like, we're not flying over the Great Lakes in November. It's a death wish, because weird things happen, planes disappear, we're not doing it. So they refused. And then the idea of sending submersibles down at a time of year when things were not at their optimum weather-wise. And then it became also financially really expensive. So that's kind of where things came to an end with that particular project. But it was while we were there, they said, Lori, would you do us a favor, and would you please work with, we have some abductees that are having trouble remembering their abduction experience. Would you hypnotize them? And so I worked with these two abductees, and they remembered quite a bit of their experience, and it was fascinating to me. So one of the abductees was, she was 15 years old not at the time I was hypnotizing her. She was in her 30s now. But she, at the time this incident happened, she was 15, and she was with a group of friends, and they all decided to order, they didn't have money, so they were going to order breadsticks from Pizza Hut. That's all they could afford. They couldn't afford pizza, but they could afford an order of breadsticks. So they ordered the breadsticks, and then she and her girlfriend decided to walk to Pizza Hut to pick up the breadsticks. And so they were walking along, and they remembered seeing something weird and looking up and saying, what's that? And then it was gone. It was just there for a second, and then it was gone. And then they continued on to Pizza Hut, and they walked in, and they said, we're here to pick up our breadsticks. And that guy said, I threw them out. And they said, why? And they said, because you ordered them, 5 hours ago or whatever it was, And they had a huge lapse of time.
Missing time.
They thought they had just walked to Pizza Hut, but no, something had happened in between where they lost several hours. And so they couldn't remember those hours. They had no memory of what happened during those hours. So my job was to work with this woman. Now, the other of the two girls, the other one they'd lost contact with her. She had lost contact with her. So I'm just working with this one woman, and she had been working with a hypnotist for like 10 years trying to remember and hadn't had any success. So I feel like maybe he warmed things up for me, this hypnotist, but because we had tremendous success that night and she remembered everything. And she said she remembered being kind of pulled up like in an invisible tractor beam up into the ship. She remembered being kind of in an oval room where you couldn't see doors or anything, but she said the seats were kind of molded out, like a bench in the room, and that she was taken into a room where she was examined, and she kind of, had this whole experience of being examined in the ship, etc. But it was fascinating, this experience that she had. And then I was also worked with another woman who she and her son had an experience in their front yard one night with, a UFO. abduction. So it was, to me, it was kind of the icing on the cake. To go there to do remote viewing with a team was really fun and quite amazing, because separately we all dowsed the map and all came up with the exact same location. But then also to be able to work with these abductees and hear their stories through hypnosis was also really fascinating.
Let's go back, though, to the three gentlemen from Amarillo who purchased the ranch. And the name of the owner, again?
Dwayne Ollinger.
Dwayne Ollinger. You started to talk about the water from the ranch.
Yes. So what we came up with through our remote viewing and through the work that we did there was that the artifact, or the most valuable thing there, was somehow the water. And we didn't know why, because why would water be extra valuable other than the fact that you are in the desert and water's always valuable in the desert? At the time that we determined the water was valuable, there was a big drought going on in Amarillo, Texas, which is where we were living at the time. And Dwayne also was living in Amarillo. And so there was this big drought. Dwayne owned a lot of land and was growing cotton on his land, as were his neighbors on their land. And because of the drought, all the cotton plants were just shriveled up, and they were not having a cotton production that year. So Dwayne brought this water to Amarillo, in containers, I'm assuming. And then he created a system through which the water would be run through a spiral and then mixed with regular irrigation water, which there wasn't a lot of irrigation water, and they weren't allowed to do a lot of irrigation because because of the drought. So he could only give a little bit of water, but he was mixing it with this water from the Blind Frog Ranch. And suddenly he had this amazing crop of cotton. And, so you go around all the ranches where everything's all shriveled up, and then his ranch, abundant cotton and gorgeous plants. So, that was one phenomena. And he gave me a jar and said, put this in your fridge. It'll help your food last longer. It'll be, and so we always kept this jar of this water from the ranch. And, so Blind Frog Ranch, I guess they also had something blue come up out of the ground. I'm trying to remember what it was. Some kind of blue material came up when they were pulling all these things out. And Dwayne just had a lot of really odd experiences out there near the, near the Skinwalker Ranch. I guess that's a place of much phenomena out there. But, anyway, so we felt very honored to be part of that whole experience way before the birth of the now popular television show.
Well, it does seem as if people interested in UFOs began seeking help from remote viewers going back quite a long time.
Hypnosis was a big thing. People have been using hypnosis for a long time to try to remember their experiences, but also a lot of my students came to me originally because they were hoping that learning remote viewing would either help them understand what they believe to be an abduction experience in their own lives, help them remember things more, or help them actually have communication with other entities, aliens, ETs, and things like that. And so I actually have many students who've studied with Stephen Greer, and Stephen's had me speak at one of his events in Temecula. And I think that there's a big interest, of course, between those who are fascinated with remote viewing and those who are fascinated with UFOs, because they seem to go hand in hand if that's your goal.
Well, there are two mysteries, I suppose, and if you can use one mystery to help give you information about another mystery, maybe that'll work. But it does seem to me to be kind of iffy.
Well, you were talking about biological robots.
Yes.
And we had an experience. I was asked to remote view, and there's actually a video. I believe it's available on YouTube. There's a video of me doing a special session for a man who wanted me to remote view the dark side of the moon and some supposed artifacts that are lying on the ground there. I did the session, and I was blind to the target. I didn't know what I would be remote viewing, but I did go into this cigar-shaped ship, And there I did find this biological robot in that, and it was not a functioning robot. It was like a dead body, so to speak. And they called her Mona Lisa. Now, I do want to say for the skeptics in your audience, some people are like, oh, this could have been manufactured and put on the internet. So that brings up the question, if, for example, let's say there was someone who wanted to create a huge fake thing to get everybody riled up, take pictures of a fake Sasquatch or take pictures of something and say, this was on the dark side of the moon. Would a remote viewer view and say, I didn't find anything, this is all bogus? Or would a remote viewer view the intention of that person to defraud? Or would a remote viewer view it as if it was a real thing?
All of those are possibilities.
All of those are possibilities. So I'm not saying that because I remote viewed this and because I experienced Mona Lisa, etc., that all of this is true. But I did have a very outstanding experience doing it, just as I had an outstanding experience viewing Sasquatch, which I didn't even believe in at the time. But in this experience, supposedly Apollo 20 was a mission that took off from Brandenburg Air Force Base to explore the dark side of the moon. And it was a collaboration between the Russians and the United States. And there was one of the Russian cosmonaut that participated, its name was Alexei Leonov, supposedly. And during this remote viewing, which was being recorded, the guy who was producing the whole video played everything backwards in reverse. And there is a point at which I say, Alexei, S-I, Alexei, in reverse, very clearly. I say it, and I've listened to it. It's clear as a bell. And that's not what I said in forward speech, but that's what came through in reverse speech. And the SI column of the remote viewing process in phase 4 of the remote viewing process, and I realize a lot of your audience.
We're talking about CRV.
Talking about controlled remote viewing, which is a written process developed by Stanford Research Institute, a man named Ingo Swann, who was at that time employed by the U.S. government, to create a written way to separate true psychic perceptions from imagination through sitting at a table with a piece of paper and having a written structure.
It's a very structured protocol.
Very structured protocol. And it's based on brain science and the interaction of right brain, left brain, conscious versus subconscious. So in this process, there are 6 phases. And in phase 4, there is a set of 8 columns, and one of those columns is called the SI column, and we call it kind of the mind reading tool of the remote viewing process or the CRV process. And it is a dramatic tool because it is something that you can use to connect with the subconscious mind of someone else. And so by saying SI Alexei, what I was saying in what we would call CRV lingo.
In reverse speech to boot.
And in reverse speech to boot was if you connect with this cosmonaut in the mind-reading column of phase 4, then you could get more information, is kind of the translation of me saying SI Alexei. And so it's fascinating because whenever I talk to you, I tell you things that are going to go out to the public that I've never talked to, that I don't usually talk to people about.
And did you follow up with that idea?
I trying to remember if I did or not. I don't know. Jim might know. Do you remember? I don't think we did. I don't think we did follow up on it. Because this was this other guy's project. He was directing it. And so we just did whatever, whatever we were directed to do. So I don't think we ever did SI Alexei. But Alexei Leonov is alive today. I would love to interview him and see if he indeed did partake in Apollo 20, if he's allowed to speak of it. Is that even still something that...
What did he find on the dark side of the moon?
Now, I have been tasked with the dark side of the moon 3 times over 20 years by totally different people and disconnected, completely non-connected remote viewings. And every single time I found big mining operations that were being conducted by ETs that were massively huge ETs. And my understanding was always that these ETs have kind of possession over whatever part of the moon that is and whatever it is they're extracting. And they don't want any interference. And that's part of the reason that we didn't continue exploring at that time, was that they were kind of like, we don't want you here.
Well, Ingo Swann, of course, in his book Penetration, writes about remote viewing some alien base on the moon and having them basically kick him out.
Yes. And I think that is possible as well, because so this again shows how completely interactive everything is. Mm-hmm. Because I was taught that when you are doing CRV, you're not leaving your body, no part of you is leaving your body, but that our subconscious minds are amazingly elastic, spiritually, and that it can kind of send out, it can dart out there amazingly quickly. It's lightning fast, zip up, get the information and bring it back in a split second of time to the conscious mind, which then has to interpret it and bring it into a way that anyone could understand it. So therefore, when we're viewing a target, we're not viewing the actual thing. We're not going to the actual place. But we're viewing what amounts to kind of like being in the holodeck of the Starship Enterprise. Oh. We're viewing like a holographic image of it, or we're visiting a copy.
I see. Something akin to the Akashic Records, perhaps.
Yes. And so we're visiting a copy of the target rather than the target itself. And because of that, it became a very useful tool for military intelligence because if you're visiting, let's say that you left your body and through an OBE, an out-of-body experience, you literally went somewhere to remote view it. Yeah. The dog might see you because you're essentially like a ghost. And we have documented cases of bilocation in which someone was having an OBE and they were actually photographed in a separate location. But that makes it a bad tool for intelligence because if you can be detected, that's no good. You know, if the spy can be seen investigating the site, then they go, uh-oh, our security.
You mean by another remote viewer
or by the
a dog? If, yes, if a dog starts barking because he sees a remote viewer, that's not necessarily going to translate into humans knowing what went on.
Well, according to the military, it does because they have security cameras, right? So if let's say that this is a secret military installation from another country, and the security guy's watching the cameras, and suddenly the guard dog is barking at something he can't see. His interpretation may be, it looks like our security's been compromised. We better change to Plan B. And if they change to Plan B, then we're back at square one as far as spying on them, so to speak, right? And I've never been in the military. I'm not a spy, folks, but that's how it's been explained to me. So going back to the theory that we're just viewing a copy of the target, it makes remote viewing, especially CRV, a really powerful tool for spies. Because if you cannot be detected, because no part of you is leaving your body and you're viewing a copy of the target, then no guard dogs are going to be barking at you and you can explore to your heart's content without detection. Therefore, when someone says, ooh, how can I protect myself against remote viewers viewing me? The answer is you can't if you have a remote viewer who really knows what they're doing. Because they will use the protocols, they will stay in structure, and they will not actually go to you, but by using this technique and these tools and being in viewing the copy of you essentially, then they can't be detected, and therefore there's no protection against it. And you know how governments are not going to want a tool against which there is no protection, right? If they can't fight it, then there are no secrets, and if there are no secrets, of course, that's extremely dangerous, for most governments.
Well, I have to imagine that even with guard dogs, that it's pretty hard to detect a remote viewer.
Well, I think so. And that's why, back in the days of the Stargate unit, every country was using remote viewers. And when I was working in the refugee program, and I was having to go to Washington 4 times a year because I was the head of this program, and the program eventually became one of the top 5 programs in the country.
To resettle refugees. And they were being resettled from all over the world. And
I had to hire people from these refugees that could speak English in order to help us resettle more from that area. So I had a staff at one point, I think it was in the teens, a staff, and they spoke all these different languages. And then we were resettling from all these different parts of the world, depending on what was happening politically. So we had the Kosovos, we had people from Bosnia, we had people from Myanmar, and all these different countries. And in talking with them, every country had a remote viewing program. And the one that really surprised me was, so I had an incident happen where a woman came in from Liberia. Mm-hmm. And this woman was a total stranger to me. I'd never met her before. And she sat down. She said, I just arrived with my husband, but I want to get a divorce, and I want you to get me a job at the meatpacking plant. And I said, but you sew. It just like came out of my mouth. And I just said, but you sew. And she went, how did you know that? And I said, do you sew? And she said, yes, I've been a tailor. I've been a seamstress. I've taught sewing. Sewing has been my entire life. She said, but I've never met you before. I just walked in. How did you know that I sew? And I said, I don't know how I sew. I knew. I just suddenly knew it. And I saw you sitting behind a sewing machine. And then my staff person who was in the room with me, who was from Suleimania in northern Iraq, said, oh, she is psychic. She said, she's psychic. And she has this program, and Saddam had it too. Because at this point in time, Saddam Hussein was still alive and very much in power in Iraq. And she was a refugee fleeing from Saddam Hussein. She said, oh, Saddam have this too. And I said, Saddam has it too, like remote viewing? And she said, yes, Saddam has it too. So it showed me when she said Saddam had it, I thought, okay, every country in the world is using some form of psychic spying. Because if you didn't, if you were in charge of a country and you didn't have a team of psychic spies that were trained to get information, you would be at a disadvantage if all the other countries have that.
Well, yes, but then there's all of the resistance to doing it, but that resistance is primarily in Western countries. That's
true, because China and Russia, behind the Iron Curtain, you know, there's that old book.
Yes, Psychic Discoveries by Ostrander and Schroeder. I've interviewed them.
Yes, and so this has been going on a long time. And if you really want to go back in time, there's the Oracle of Delphi and all these things.
It goes back to ancient times. The use of oracles, the use of shamans, and Sufis. In the Islamic countries, every now and then the Sufis would be advisors to the caliph.
Exactly. So it goes back thousands of years.
Yes, it does.
To the beginning of recording.
And it's in the Bible.
It's in the Bible, exactly. Yeah. Jim's sister has recently been sending us videos about this man named Paul Wallace, who was a former pastor in the Anglican Church, who has done a study about UFOs and aliens in the Bible, and the Elohim, and the archangels and all these things, and how actually these were probably ETs from another planet. And forgive me, Paul Wallace, if you're watching, because if I'm in any way misquoting him, guys, take it with a grain of salt. But because I'm definitely not a scholar on this. But the videos with Paul Wallace are fascinating, and he has a number of books out. And I am really interested in reading his books because having been really immersed in the Bible and, in a missionary for 20 years myself, I ended up memorizing a huge portion of the Bible. Yeah. And I do see the Bible as some sort of a document that has prophecies and things in it. And therefore, when I look at what the Bible says is supposed to be happening right now, and those things are happening, it is kind of interesting to me. I'm no longer, a church-going Christian in that way. Just mainly because my remote viewing experiences have really broadened my belief system, to not in a way that has moved me away from spirituality, but I think it's moved me more into spirituality and a greater amount of faith even than before. But at the same time, I think it's very possible that we were planted here or put here by beings or that were seen as gods. And that we definitely have abilities way beyond what we can, solid things.
Well, it certainly does seem to me that the human psyche is much larger, much vaster, and has many more capabilities than most of us ever come to appreciate. Now, the Elohim, for people who don't know, it's a Hebrew word for God, and it happens to be a plural in the Hebrew language. So the very first sentence in the book of Genesis in Hebrew is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, but it's a plural word. The gods, the Elohim, were sometimes considered the heavenly host, the angels. And so the connection here is between angels and aliens.
Exactly. So the interesting thing is thinking if God, which we, if humans just conceived of these people as being gods, initially people believed in many types of gods. Yes. And of course we have the indigenous cultures that see, the elements of the earth, fire and wind and earth and water, and almost worship those and, and honor the four directions and all those things.
Well, indigenous people see spirit everywhere and everything.
Exactly. Yeah. And the great mystery is considered to be God. It's kind of a broader idea of God. And so, what I found though is when I would try to narrow it down to one being, that's kind of a grandfatherly guy up there judging and things, that kind of got blown out of the water when you're remote viewing and you're contacted by interdimensional beings. Now, you and I have had many discussions, and we have talked about entities and ghosts and, people speaking from beyond the departed. We've talked about Sasquatch. We've talked about ETs. And in talking about all these things, one of the things people don't realize about remote viewing, initially, it's wax on, wax off, and you're like, gosh, the structure of this written thing, how does this even work? Where is this going to get me just practicing these things? Kind of like any martial art, it's like, I've got to do this first, I've got to learn to do this. And it could seem boring, or learning to play scales on the piano before you can play a concerto. But in reality, where it leads you is to the point where, especially using the SI column, we have been contacted by interdimensional beings in some of our sessions, really unexpectedly, and especially coming from a belief system that did not allow for that, to have that come through anyway, has been life-changing, completely, for both Jim and I, and really kind of responsible for us being where we are now, because of the guidance that we've had.
What you're suggesting for people who may not grasp it is simply that we are surrounded by helpers.
We are surrounded by helpers, and we also are surrounded by beings. I think I was going to go back earlier when I couldn't remember what I was talking about. I think I was going to go back to talking about how these beings can communicate with us. We can be communicated with by a number of things, and all of them are connected. And I believe the connecting thing is consciousness. And I think we're not even beginning to scratch the surface of truly understanding consciousness and what it is. But I do believe that studying, for example, CRV is a way of starting to scratch the surface. And we're on the cutting edge of learning about consciousness. And I believe that these bio beings, that there are ships that are biological in nature. I do believe that, because that now they're starting to experiment with combining biology and robotics, or combining and AI and all these things, right? We're suddenly branching out. It's almost like we're having this explosion of experimentation and branching out, and everything's suddenly multiplying. And when I was talking before about CRV being something that can't be detected, and you said that penetration, Ingo had the experience where they kicked him out. And I was saying, well, governments were afraid of CRV because you can't be detected because you're only viewing a copy of it. Well, that was the way I was taught. But even though I was taught that we're viewing a copy of it, when I told Mel that I had been taught that, Mel disagreed vehemently and said, I know that I bilocated to the Galactic Federation. I know I was there, and there was a part of me that was actually there, it wasn't just me remote viewing it. I was there. And Mel actually did a thing once where he was with a group of people and he was talking about remote viewing. He was there to discuss remote viewing, and to convince someone, he stepped out of his body and walked around the table and tapped her on the shoulder while he was still sitting in front of her. And she went, and so he was trying to, he was an amazing guy. He had a lot of abilities, and he had his whole upbringing with the Ho-Chunk natives, Native Americans. So he was brought up in a very mystical way. So I think that people don't realize that if they can just do the wax on, wax off and go through the preliminary things, it can lead to many exciting experiences.
Now, when you say wax on, wax off, I think that comes from a martial arts movie, isn't that?
Yes, Karate Kid.
The Karate Kid is taught.
The kid is so bored because he's having to paint the fence and he's having to wax the car and he doesn't understand. I want to learn more. I want to learn karate and you're making me wax your car and paint your fence. And the guy's like, this is all part of it. I think the learning scales on the piano and the initial parts of CRV, which people might find like, okay, why am I doing this? It's what it leads to. It's building the foundation that you need to stand firmly in order to really expand your consciousness in a way that will be very, very rewarding in the long run. But you got to pay your dues first, right? You got to learn the scales before you can play the concerto. So, that to me, that's the exciting thing of the great mystery. And also, I do want to say for all the listeners, there's so many things out there right now. Facebook has become the marketplace of souls in a way, and there's just constantly getting bombarded with ads from people selling everything from snake oil to, whatever.
And there are over 1,000 discussion groups on topics that we cover on New Thinking Aloud.
Exactly.
On Facebook.
There's so much bombarding us now. The world has become so electronic, and we are bombarded continually with information. So with all that, to say, how do we separate truth from lies? You hear people saying, don't believe that. That's just fake media, for example. So how do we separate truth from lies right now? And I feel like remote viewing and consciousness is the answer. Plus, we've got eyes in our heads. We've got ears in our heads. We can also we need to see what's right before us. When people say, for example, this is fake media or whatever, during COVID, I was being bombarded by every side. People were saying, Lori, watch this YouTube video. This will tell you what's really happening. And then people were saying, no, listen to the doctors and, listen to what this article says. And so you're getting bombarded. Not just me, everybody was getting bombarded from every side.
And still is. And
still are now with what's happening in the world. And so I was like, how can I help people separate truth from lies? How can I help them discern? Because you can't just trust what you read and watch. But you can trust your intuition, especially if you can be blind tasked. So in other words, if I were to decide to sit down and do a remote viewing session on what's happening in the White House today, I would not trust what I would get. Because I'm too biased to think, if I knew what I was remote viewing, I could make up all kinds of things. So, the imagination is a powerful tool. So, being blind tasked means where you, for example, come to me and say, Lori, I have a project for you I'd like you to work on. The project number is 15684. And I start remote viewing without having a clue what it is. Now, I would do that with you because I trust you. I know you. I wouldn't do it from just anyone because you wouldn't want some terrorist group saying, Lori, I have a session for you. The target's a location and it happens to be the location of the next place to bomb, or something, So you need to know who you're accepting things from. And then also another important point is track records. You, as a viewer, you need to have a solid proven track record in provable targets. So that, as we've talked about before, if I've done 100 sessions and I've databased all my results on provable targets, like pictures in envelopes or whatever, something that has solid proof to it, then we can database and know what is my track record with colors, what is my track record with material objects, what is my track record describing people, etc. So I happen to have a very strong track record with people, describing people, but so that if you have a good track record, then you could take someone with a proven track record and task them with something for which there might not be provable stuff afterwards. But then we could kind of depend on the results based on their data and how good they are. So all of that to say that if you start out with this great foundation, you can eventually get to the point where you could have conversations with ETs. You could view alien civilizations. You could look at the biology, the biological robots, and see how is this even made. Mm-hmm. There's a show called The Alaska Triangle. It's season 1, episode 9. That's called What Lies Beneath Mount Hayes, I believe. And I am in that. I was a remote viewer in that project.
Oh,
that But the thing that I found, which I asked them to please not televise, to not include in the show, and they didn't. But I viewed Mount Hayes, and I was blind to the target, but I saw it so clearly, and then went inside, and there are tunnels under there. There are polished floors and tunnels all underneath them, and I didn't see them as alien tunnels. I saw them as human American-based tunnels underneath there. But I think they are working in conjunction with ETs, and I think it's become pretty accepted now that we have government officials, or our government does work hand in hand with ETs. And we have this from numerous sources. Lynn Buchanan experienced that in the military and actually saw ETs side by side with humans in his experience. Okay, yeah, and there's a book called Walking with the Tall Whites, written by a man named Charles Hall. Mm-hmm. And we've actually had dinner with Charles Hall, and he, we have his book, but he had experience with these. So he was in the military, and he was stationed out in somewhere in Nevada, and he had all these experiences with these aliens he refers to as the tall whites. Mm-hmm. And I've had a couple of experiences with the tall whites myself, having these aliens kind of take me out of my body in the middle of the night, and then waking in these experiences. They were tall and white, and this was before I'd ever heard of the tall whites. But then he saw them interacting with his officials, these superior officers. Mm-hmm. And he talks about it in a book called Walking with the Tall Whites. And there's also 2 documentaries on Amazon Prime called Walking with the Tall Whites.
There's also a fellow named Chaim Eshed, who was an Israeli, in charge of the Israeli space program, whatever that was, who made the claim that the United States government and other governments have entered into agreements with aliens. I don't know if these are written agreements or informal agreements or protocols. I am not sure, but one has to take remarks like that with from people who have been senior government officials seriously.
Yes, and even in talking with Harold Putoff, Hal Putoff. Yes. Have you interviewed?
Never interviewed Hal, but he's been a friend for many, many years.
Yes, and he, just in talking with him, and he talks about UFOs and ETs very much like they are existing.
Indeed he does.
And so, and he's got some...
He's looked into it seriously.
He's a renowned physicist. He's extremely respected. And my understanding is he has more top secret clearances than just about anybody. Mm-hmm. And so he's also friends with Bigelow. Yes. And so when he's talking about that kind of thing, it's not like you can say, do aliens exist? When you've got this eminent person talking about them.
The evidence is overwhelming that something is going on.
And, he talked about the blue shift. Are you familiar with the blue shift?
No.
So Hal was talking about these ships that are surrounded by a thing called the blue shift. Mm-hmm. And if they fly low enough, everything that hits the blue shift dies of old age very quickly. Oh. It's because the blue shift time moves much quicker within the blue shift. Yeah. Now, if this thing is encapsulated by time moving quicker as it's flying through our reality and our aerospace, then that kind of makes you question, what is reality? What is time? Mm-hmm. How can time act differently within one thing that's flying through this time period, time thing? And Lynn and I have fascinating conversations all the time, when we talk, and we love to talk about time because CRV is an amazing time machine. You can move forward and
yes, we've done an interview about just that.
Just about time. And so Lynn was talking about how, let's say you look up and you see a UFO, and it kind of just appears and disappears very quickly, or it does what appears to be impossible in its movements. Yes. It could be because of the way time is working and time is manipulated. Because if if it's actually moving through time differently, it would appear to us that it's doing these impossible things, but it could be because it has the ability to travel through time at a different speed.
We could go into a long discussion about the reports from people who claim that they've actually piloted UFOs and the disorientation that occurs when they begin various forms of maneuvering through time.
That is fascinating. And you've done some interviews with
I did an interview with Grant Cameron about, he wrote the book UFO Sky Pilots, but actually these reports have come from elsewhere. These reports have come to me indirectly. Well, actually, now that I think about it, Danny Sheehan, the attorney who represents Stephen Greer and represented John Mack and is deeply immersed in the UFO disclosure process, has been interviewed several times now on New Thinking Aloud. And he's reported to me that in these secret organizations where there are now whistleblowers coming out and dealing with captured vehicles, where these people they're trying to train humans to pilot them. And in this case, it's very difficult because of the disorientation that occurs as soon as time begins to get warped or changed in one way or another. It's something you have to get used to. It. You can't just sort of easily adjust to that.
I agree. And I am convinced that time is not stable, at least not as stable as we would hope it to be.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think there has been actual time travel. I talk about CRV being a time machine, and we can experience things in different times. Yeah. But that's not exactly time travel. It's not like I'm physically going, 100 years back in time or something. But I do believe there have been time travel because there's been evidence of it in many different
There are mysterious artifacts, things that appear to be modern, that are found in geological strata that are very old. And I just did an interview with Eric Wargo, who is a writer who writes about time.
He wrote Time Loops.
He wrote Time Loops, and he has a new book. The title is Time Faring. Are we going to become a time-faring civilization as well as a space-faring civilization? And
wouldn't that be something?
he goes into the prospects for actual physical time travel. Although it might not be physical, remote viewing certainly offers another vehicle for that.
For time faring, yes. And where we run into trouble is when we try to move into the future. Mm-hmm. And so moving into the future becomes difficult, and perhaps that happens to do with the nature of the universe. Mm-hmm. Because if the future splits off into many different directions, then you don't know if the future you're viewing is the same one you're going to experience, so to speak. So that's also another fascinating aspect to the whole thing.
Well, I did just interview Tom Campbell about that very question. And
what did he say?
He said that when you look at the future, you're looking at probabilities. Because the future hasn't happened yet, and the probabilities can change right up until the moment.
That is so true. Mm-hmm. And if you go on Lynn Buchanan's website, which is crviewer.com, he has free resources on there. And one of them is a list of analogies. Mm-hmm. And one of those analogies, I think, is called A Rock in the Pond of Time, in which it's a wonderful analogy that helps people understand why the future is not stable, and why, for example, you might view something in the future and say that's definitely going to happen. But then when the time arrives, if it doesn't happen, it can sometimes be because that's the bug that got away, so to speak, because of ripples through time that change things. And so it's a wonderful analogy. And if anybody ever wants to kind of understand some of the more difficult things to understand, read Lynn Buchanan's analogies on his website.
On his website.
It's on his website.
crviewer.com.
crviewer.com. Also on my website, intuitivespecialist.com, we also have a ton of free resources for people that are watching this. If they want to just kind of dive in and get into some wild stuff. I've been writing blogs since 2010. So there's a lot of interesting, fascinating blogs. I also have teaching blogs that are mini classes. And then we also have a lot of other free resources for teaching. So for people who don't want to spend money, we have free classes and free resources there as well at intuitivespecialists.com. And I had to promote Lynn's website, though, because, both of us are very impassioned about sharing this with the world in a way that if anybody, even people with zero resources or finances, could still get a lot out of it.
Well, Lori Williams, what a rich and informative and inspiring conversation. And what a joy to be with you. Thank you so much for coming to Albuquerque.
Thanks so much for having me again. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you. We always dive so deep and get into so many things.
Yes, indeed. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.